They told me the Kandahar Valley doesn't whisper. It screams. Not in ways you hear with your ears, you feel it somewhere behind your sternum, in that hollow space between your last breath and your next one. I learned that lesson on the 4th day. The hard way. The way you learn everything out here that actually matters. My name is Specialist Nora Calloway. 23 years old. 5'6" in boots. From a small nothing town in eastern Tennessee where the biggest thing that ever happened was a Walmart opening in 2009. I had been deployed to FOB Salerno for 11 weeks when Lieutenant Hargrove called me into the briefing tent and said the words that changed the weather inside my chest permanently. Calloway. We've got a problem. He didn't look up from the satellite imagery spread across the folding table. 3 other men in the tent, Sergeant Bauer, Staff Sergeant Kelleher, and a CIA analyst whose name I was never given, a thin pale man who smelled like airplane and old coffee. None of them looked at me either. That told me more than the words did. I pulled off my gloves. Tucked them into my vest. Stood at the table. Sit down, Hargrove said. I sat. He finally looked up. His face was the kind of face that had already done the math and didn't like the answer. You know who Ghazwan al-Rimi is? I did. Everyone at Salerno did. Everyone in the theater of operations did. Al-Rimi was a ghost story soldiers told each other on cold nights when the generator was humming and the coffee was bad, not to scare themselves, exactly, but to remind themselves that the war had textures they hadn't yet touched. He was Yemeni-born, recruited by ISIS-K, trained in the mountains of Nuristan by a man whose name nobody could confirm. In 4 years he had made confirmed kills at ranges that made other snipers go quiet when they heard the numbers. 2,200 meters. 2,600, once allegedly across a mountain saddle in Kunar province at something approaching 2 miles. He favored the Steyr HS.50. He shot at dawn. He never missed twice, which was his most terrifying quality. The first shot was the warning. He gave one. The second was the period at the end of his sentence. He had killed 11 coalition soldiers. 3 officers. A Pakistani intelligence director. A French journalist. And, 12 days ago, he had killed Captain David Osei, our FOB's forward intelligence commander, with a single round through a vehicle window at 1,400 meters while Osei was reviewing a route map outside the wire. I stared at the satellite image on the table. The ridgeline east of Debala district. I knew that ridgeline. I had studied it the week before as part of a sector orientation exercise. Limestone formations that step down like broken teeth toward a dry wadi. 3 kilometers of dead ground between the high ground and our patrol routes. Intel puts him back in sector, the CIA analyst said, to nobody in particular. He's been tasked. We don't know the next target, but there's a senior Afghan National Army general doing a site inspection at the Debala substation in 6 days. Hargrove looked at me. I'm sending you out with a 2-man support element. Kelleher on comms and observation. PFC Timmons as your security. You'll insert before first light, day after tomorrow. You'll establish a hide position here. He put his finger on a map coordinate I had to lean forward to read. And you will find al-Rimi before he finds his target. I looked at the coordinate. Looked at the ridgeline photo. Did the math myself? That's inside his effective range, sir. Yes. He'll see me before I see him. Probably. Sir. Yes, Calloway. Why me? Bauer made a sound. Not quite a laugh. The CIA analyst studied the tent ceiling. Hargrove said, because you're the only shooter we have who qualified at distance last rotation. Because Osei was my friend. And because al-Rimi's never been hunted by someone he doesn't think is hunting him. He paused. He doesn't know you exist. That's the only advantage we have. He wasn't wrong. And I hated him for being right. I went back to my bunk and sat on the edge of it for a long time. My roommate, Specialist Diaz, was writing a letter home. She was always writing letters home, actual paper letters, which she folded into thirds and tucked into an envelope she sealed with a specific brand of cherry lip balm because she said her mother recognized the smell. I had watched her do it a dozen times. I found it deeply comforting in a way I couldn't explain and had never told her. "You okay?" she said, without looking up. "Sure." She looked up. I was apparently not a convincing liar when my face was doing what it was doing. "Nora. I'm fine. Big mission. I'm thinking." She capped her pen. Folded her hands. Gave me the look she gave me when she was about to say something I wouldn't want to hear but would need. "Is it Al Remy?" I stared at her. "Come on," she said. "Half the FOB knows. Hargrove's been locked in briefings since morning. Osei's death messed everybody up. And you're the only dedicated long-range shooter on base." She shrugged. "It's not hard math." "Then, you do it," I said. She smiled. "I'm a medic, baby. I fix what he breaks. That's the division of labor." She picked up her pen again. Then, put it down again. "Hey. You're good, Calloway. I've watched you shoot. You're genuinely good. He's better. Today he is." I looked at her. She was already writing again. 2 days later I was on my stomach on the Earth and the Earth was trying to swallow me. We inserted at 0340 hours. Helicopter drop 4 kilometers west of the objective ridgeline, then, a foot movement through the dark that Kelleher navigated by terrain and, by the particular quality of his own silence, he was the kind of man who got quieter the more dangerous things became, which I appreciated because it meant I could calibrate my fear to his volume. When he stopped talking entirely and started moving in that specific looseland way, the way a man moves when he's stopped thinking about his body and started listening with it, I knew we were inside whatever invisible perimeter around danger that his instincts had mapped over 15 years of deployments. Timmons was 20 years old. He was from Baton Rouge and he had a sister he was putting through community college with his combat pay. He had told me this twice, on 2 different occasions, both times with the same careful casualness that meant he wanted me to know but didn't want to seem like he wanted me to know. I liked him for that. I liked that he cared about something that specific. We moved off the helicopter insertion point and into a draw that angled northeast, following the dry stream bed, feet working the loose shale the way you work it when you've been taught right. Weight back, roll to the outside edge of the boot, don't let the stone click against stone if you can avoid it. Kandahar in March is cold in a way that gets personal with you. It finds the gap between your collar and your neck. It settles into the wrist where your sleeve doesn't quite reach your glove. It was around 28 degrees and the sky above us was showing the first pale grayness at the eastern edge that meant we had maybe 90 minutes before full light. We needed a hide before full light. We found it at 0512. A natural shelf of limestone, 15 meters below the military crest of a secondary ridgeline that gave us a sector of observation covering the main ridgeline, the wadi, and approximately 400 meters of the patrol route where the ANA General's convoy would pass in 6 days. The position had natural overhead cover from a fractured slab that leaned against the shelf like a drunk against a wall. There was a 3-inch gap between the slab and the rock shelf that I could shoot through or observe through without exposing my muzzle or my optics to the sun. Kelleher looked at it for a long time. "Not bad," he said. Which from Kelleher was the tactical equivalent of applause. We packed ourselves in. Timmons took the back corner with his M4 and a line of sight up the draw we'd come from. Kelleher set up the spotting scope, a Leupold Mark V HD, 25 power, the good kind, and I got prone behind my rifle. My rifle was a Mk13 Mod 7, chambered in .300 Win Mag. The Army had tried to give me the M2010 but I'd put in a specific request for the Mk13 and Hargrove had come through, which meant he was either generous or desperate. At that moment it felt like both. The Mk13 was built like a conversation you didn't want to have, precise, cold, patient. I had put maybe 4,000 rounds through it in my time. I knew how it spoke. I knew what it meant when the trigger broke clean versus when it had something on its mind. I settled into the stock. Adjusted the bipod 0.5 millimeter. put my cheek on the cheekpiece. The valley opened in front of me through the Nightforce scope. And I started looking for a ghost. Day 1. Nothing. Day 1 is always nothing. You have to learn a sector the way you learn a person, slowly, in layers, by noticing what changes between one observation and the next. The first day you're cataloging. You're building the picture in your head that you'll measure every subsequent observation against. I spent 12 hours mapping every rock formation, every shadow pattern, every piece of terrain on the opposite ridgeline that could serve as a firing position. I logged 22 possible hides. 22 places a man could lie still and reach out and end someone from. At night we ate cold, rotated sleep in 2-hour blocks, and did not speak above a breath. The stars over Kandahar were extraordinary in a way I found deeply annoying. There is something wrong about a sky that beautiful sitting over a valley this broken. Day 2. Nothing. That was everything. At 11:40 I was glassing the far ridgeline. I had gotten to possible height number 14, a cluster of boulders at approximately 2,600 meters, when something moved. Not much. A shift in the way the shadow lay inside a rock cluster. The kind of thing your brain dismisses as wind-moved gravel or a bird landing. I might have dismissed it too. But I had grown up hunting white-tailed deer in the hills of East Tennessee with my father, who had the patience of a geologic event and who had told me when I was 11 years old, "Baby, the animal doesn't move. The landscape does. When those are the same thing, that's when you look again." I looked again. "Kelleher," I breathed. "On it." He'd already moved the spotting scope. 30 seconds. "Shadow," he said. "I know. Could be rock." "It's not rock." Another 30 seconds. The shadow didn't move. But there was something about the geometry of it, the way it lay at a slightly wrong angle to the sun's current position. Rock shadows have logic. They follow the geometry of the object casting them. This shadow was about 3 inches longer than it should have been for that size of boulder at this hour. 3 inches, I said. Yeah. Kelleher's voice did the thing it did when he was running calculations. Went flat. Stripped of everything that wasn't information. Could be a rifle barrel. Could be a spotting scope. At that angle, at this time of day, it's a barrel pointed our general direction. Silence. "He's not on us," Kelleher said. "Not yet. He's scouting the patrol route. For 6 more days he's scouting." I kept the reticle floating just left of that shadow. My heart rate was doing something I told it to stop doing. It didn't stop. My hands were fine. I've always had steady hands, which is either a gift or a character defect, I haven't decided, but my pulse was in my ears, rhythmic and intrusive like a neighbor's bass line through an apartment wall. He was there. 2,600 meters away. The most dangerous man in this theater of war was lying on his stomach looking at the same valley I was looking at, and he didn't know I was here. That was the only card I held. I needed to play it right. I didn't sleep that night. Not really. I cycled through the 2-hour blocks, but what I was doing wasn't sleep, it was a state of reduced consciousness in which my mind kept running a problem it couldn't solve yet. Range. Wind. The Coriolis effect at that distance, which at over a mile becomes a factor you cannot ignore. His position was at approximately 2,600 meters. I'd never taken a shot past 1,800 in combat conditions. In training I had engaged targets at 2,200 from a stable static position with known conditions. This was not that. I lay in the dark and I thought about my father. I thought about the first deer I ever killed, a 6-point buck on a November morning, the world white with early frost, and the way my father had put his hand on my shoulder after and said nothing for a full minute. Not nothing wrong. Nothing that was fuller than words. I thought about Osei. I had never spoken to him directly. I'd seen him twice in the operations center, bent over maps, laughing at something with one of his lieutenants. He had a loud laugh. The kind that changes the acoustics of a room. I thought about the ANA general who would drive that patrol route in 5 days and whose name I didn't know and whose life was currently a problem I was responsible for solving. At 0300 Timmons whispered from his corner, "Calloway. Yeah. You been awake this whole rotation." "I'm fine." "You want the last of the Skittles?" I almost laughed. I took the Skittles. They were mostly red and orange because Timmons had already eaten the purple and green ones, which I had learned over 2 weeks of operations with him was a consistent and, apparently deeply held preference. I ate the Skittles. I stared at the dark. 5 days. On day 3 he moved. Not much. Not in a way that would mean anything to anyone who hadn't been studying the same 14 square meters of limestone ridgeline for 48 hours. But I had been. I had the geometry of that rock cluster memorized the way you memorize a face you're afraid of involuntarily, completely, with a specificity that lived in your body rather than your brain. He shifted his position by approximately 2 meters to the north, toward a second rock formation that gave him a fractionally better angle on the ANA patrol route's primary choke point, a natural funnel where the Wadi bent east and the road narrowed between 2 earthen berms. It was a better shooting position. He was optimizing. "He's building a nest," Kelleher said. "He's already built it. He's decorating." Kelleher looked at me over the spotting scope. "He's been on that ridgeline longer than we've been on this one," I said. "He inserted before we did. He's in his final position. He's just settling in." I paused. "He knows exactly where he's shooting from. He's done the math. He just needs the date. So do we." 3 days. The problem I had been running in my head since night 1 crystallized. At 2,600 meters with the Mk13 and .300 Win Mag, I was at the absolute edge of my cartridge's reliable performance envelope. Not the rifles, the cartridges. The .300 Win Mag is a flat-shooting, high-BC round, but at true sniper distances past 2,000 meters it begins to give up velocity in ways that affect terminal performance. More importantly, it affects drift. At 2,600 meters, a 10 miles per hour crosswind, which in the Kandahar Valley is considered a calm day, would push my bullet approximately 80 inches laterally. 6.5 feet. In a combat position with no wind station, estimating that crosswind to the precision needed was not science. It was something closer to listening. I had been listening to the valley for 3 days. The wind here had a pattern. It was not consistent, but it was rhythmic in the way all things in mountain terrain are rhythmic, call it the lungs of the valley, breathing in a cycle tied to the temperature differential between the valley floor and the ridgeline. In the mornings, from first light to approximately 0900, the wind came off the high ground from the northeast, running about 8 to 12 miles per hour, a quartering headwind from my left. By midday it died almost completely. By 1400 it reversed, pushing up the valley from the southwest, lighter, around 6 miles per hour. It held that through late afternoon. Then, in the hour before dark it picked up again to 15 miles per hour from the north, gusty and uneven. He would shoot in that midday window. If I were him, I would. Minimal wind. Maximum predictability. And if I were going to stop him, I had to shoot before he did. That was the whole problem on one line. "Walk me through it again," Kelleher said on the evening of day 3. Night had come down hard and fast the way it does at elevation, the temperature dropping 15 degrees in 30 minutes, and we were eating cold MRE components with the particular focused resentment of people who had been eating cold MRE components for 3 days. "Walk you through what?" "Your shot solution. From the top." I looked at him. He had his hands wrapped around a Nalgene bottle of water that was serving as a hand warmer. In the low light of the ridgeline, no artificial light, ever, his face was all plains and shadow. "You want to check my math. I want to understand your math. There's a difference." Timmons pretended to be asleep. He was not asleep. I set down my food and thought about how to say it. Range is 2,580 to 2,620 meters, depending on which exact position he fires from. I'm calling it 2,600. Elevation differential, we're approximately 40 meters higher than his position, which gives me a slight downward angle, which means I'm correcting for the cosine. The real angle is maybe 2 degrees. Manageable. I pulled my knee up to my chest. Wind. In the midday window, quartering from the southwest at 6 miles an hour. That's my best case scenario. If he shoots in that window, which I believe he will, I'm correcting for 24 inches of drift to the right. Call it 1.5 moe. I paused. Bullet drop at 2,600 meters with a 185 Grainberger at 2,950 fps muzzle velocity. I'm looking at approximately 26 feet of drop. 26 feet. I have to hold over an entire small vehicle. And, you've confirmed your ballistic data. I've been running the Kestrel for 3 days. I've got density, altitude, temperature, humidity. I've built the solution in the tablet. I looked at the valley. The number is a number. The number I trust. What I don't trust is the human part. What's the human part? I thought about how to say this too. He'll be still. Men like Al-Rimi, when they're in position, they disappear into the terrain. They become geological. The target I'll be shooting at will be partially concealed, partially obscured by his own fieldcraft, at a range where my bullet will be in the air for over 2 seconds. Anything that moves in those 2 seconds, I stopped. He moves, you miss. I miss. Or worse, I wound. And, if I wound him, I've announced myself. I've given up my position. And, whatever he is when he's hurt and knows someone found him, that's not something I've calculated for. Kelleher was quiet for a long time. Then, he said, my first deployment, Ramadi, 2005. My team sergeant told me something. He said the most dangerous shot a sniper ever takes is the one they're not sure about. Because the sure shot, you're all mechanics. Everything works. The unsure shot, you start thinking. And, thinking, he shook his head, thinking will get you killed every time. I looked at him. So what are you telling me? I'm telling you to stop thinking and start knowing. I don't know yet. Then, you've got 2 more days to get there. He pulled his poncho liner tighter and, that was the end of the conversation. Day 4 was the one that broke me open. I was on the scope at 0720, early in the northeast wind, the valley laid out in that particular sharp quality of early mountain light where everything looks newly cut, all edges, no softness anywhere. I was running my standard observation pattern, sector left to right, far ground to near ground, specific dwell time on the 14 identified priority points, when I saw him. Not a shadow this time. His face. For approximately 4 seconds, Ghazwan Al-Rimi shifted his position to observe something to his south and his face came out of the terrain concealment and I saw it in my scope. Brown skin weathered to the color and texture of old wood. Dark beard. A pale scar or patch of lighter skin across the left cheekbone. He was wearing a ghillie overlay of shredded local vegetation. His fieldcraft was extraordinary, even now, and he was completely relaxed. His movements were the movements of a man who had been in this kind of stillness so many times that it had become his natural state. He was looking at something south of his position with a quality of attention that was almost contemplative. There was nothing in his expression that resembled urgency or fear. He looked like a man sitting in his own living room. 4 seconds. Then, he resettled and the terrain swallowed him again. I realized my heart rate had not changed. My hands had not changed. The reticle had drifted by maybe a quarter MOA while I was watching. And, I realized something else. I realized I didn't feel what I was supposed to feel. There was no rage on behalf of Osei. No righteous fire. No clarity of purpose settling over me like a benediction. What I felt was stranger and less comfortable than any of that. I felt the weight of the distance between us. 2,600 meters. About 1.5 miles. In that distance lived everything, 2 seconds of bullet flight, the wind I couldn't fully know, the slight error in my range estimate, the imperfect density altitude reading, the condition of my barrel, the imperfect quality of my own heartbeat. In that distance lived the 11 coalition soldiers he'd killed, and Osei's laugh changing the acoustics of the operations center, and the ANA general whose name I still didn't know. In that distance lived the 4 seconds I just watched him breathe like a man at peace. I hated that last part most of all. Kelleher said, quietly, "You saw him. 4 seconds. Good look? Good enough. Range? 2,610, he's at the north end of that cluster." Kelleher made a quiet notation in his log. Then, "How are you?" I thought about saying fine. The word was already on its way to my mouth when something rerouted it. "I'm okay," I said instead. I need a minute." Take 2. I put my eye back to the scope and let the valley fill my vision and thought about my father and the 6-point buck and the hand on my shoulder and the silence that was fuller than words. I was here because I was good at this. I was here because Hargrove had no one else. I was here because someone had to be, and that is the least heroic and most honest reason for anything. I held the reticle on the rock cluster at 2,610 meters. I started knowing. Day 5 brought the first serious complication. At 1350, in the quiet midday window I had been counting on, a second figure appeared on the far ridgeline. Not at Al-Rimi's position. 300 meters south of it, lower on the slope, moving with a purpose that was either patrol or communication. Carrying what Kelleher identified through the spotting scope as an AK pattern rifle and a radio. Young, by his movement. Uneven footfalls, not trained to the terrain yet. A spotter. Or a relay courier. Or perimeter security. Al-Rimi had support. Kelleher was already on the radio, whispered brevity codes, getting the information back to Salerno. I kept my scope on the figure and ran the new problem. If Al-Rimi had a support element, there could be more. There could be a security ring I hadn't detected because I'd been focused on the primary target position. If I engaged Al-Rimi and missed, or if I engaged him and his support element had a firing line to our position, Timmons and Kelleher were in a fight they hadn't come equipped for. Timmons with an M4 and about 400 rounds. Kelleher with a sidearm and a radio. Hargrove says hold, Kelleher reported. They're assessing exfil options. How long does assessing take? He said hold. The general's convoy is in 2 days. I know that. If they pull us out now and reinsert, I know, Callaway. I said a word that I generally tried not to say. Timmons very carefully looked at the ceiling of our hide. The support element figure moved south and disappeared behind a fold of ground. I watched the rock cluster. Nothing. Al-Rimi hadn't moved. He was aware of his support element but uninterested in it. The support was for his comfort, not his shooting. He didn't need them to make the shot. He'd never needed anyone to make a shot. Kelleher. Yeah. I'm not leaving. Silence. I'm not leaving, I said again. You can tell Hargrove whatever he needs to hear. But, I'm not leaving this position. We know where he is. We know his window. We leave and we lose all of that. I paused. I'm not leaving. Kelleher breathed out through his nose. Looked at the radio. Looked at me. Neither am I, said Timmons, from the corner, eyes still on the ceiling. Kelleher keyed the radio. Hargrove authorized a hold and a repositioning of a QRF element to within 2 kilometers of our position, which was the Army's way of saying, we don't want to lose you but we're not going to stop you. I understood. I appreciated it more than I would have been able to say out loud at that moment. That night I reconstructed my entire shot solution. Not because the numbers had changed. Because I needed the process. I needed to move through the mechanics with my hands and my eyes and my notebook until the solution stopped being calculation and became certainty, the kind of certainty that isn't confidence in yourself but confidence in the physics. The physics didn't care about my anxiety. The physics would behave exactly as they always had regardless of what the situation cost. There was something deeply comforting about that if you could get yourself to the right angle to see it. I wrote the numbers down. Range, 2,610 meters. Elevation, minus 40 meters, cosine factor applied, effective range 2,607. Wind, midday window, 6 miles per hour from 225 degrees, quartering tailwind from left rear, 0.8 MOA right correction. Drop, 302 MOA total, 25.8 feet. Holdover established using second focal plane reticle subtensions. Density altitude, 6,400 feet, velocity correction applied. Temperature, 58 degrees Fahrenheit at midday, negligible effect. Target size, torso-sized, approximately 18 inches wide. At 2,610 meters, subtends approximately 0.29 MOA. My correction margin for error, less than 0.15 MOA. That last number was the one I stayed with. 0.15 MOA. At 2,610 meters, that was the difference between a clean shot and a miss. Less than half an inch of error in my correction, and the bullet would miss by more than a foot. I closed my notebook. I lay back and stared up at the underside of the limestone slab. Somewhere out there in the dark, 2,610 meters away, Ghazwan al-Rimi was also lying on his back or sitting with his thoughts, counting down to a different ending than the one I was planning for him. He had done this before. Many more times than I had. He had computed range and wind and drop on men who were better armed and better positioned and better prepared than me, and he had been right every time. The question I couldn't answer, the one that had been sitting in the corner of my mind since night one like Timmons in his corner, patient, unavoidable, was this: was I better than he was? I didn't know. I fell asleep with that question still open, which was either a sign of maturity or a sign that exhaustion had overridden everything else. I suspected the latter. The morning of day 6 I woke up knowing. Not comfortable. Not confident. Not any of the things the stories tell you a soldier feels before the moment that will define whatever comes after. I felt the way the valley felt before the sun crested the ridgeline, cool and very still, stripped of everything decorative, entirely itself. That was the closest I could get to describing it. I looked at the rock cluster at 2,610 meters. The shadow was there, exactly where it had been for 6 days. Slightly wrong geometry. 4 inches too long. He was there. Kelleher was already on the spotting scope. He looked at me. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The ANA General's convoy was scheduled to reach the choke point at the Wadi Bend at approximately 1,100 hours. I knew because Hargrove had confirmed it on the previous night's Combs window. 6 vehicles. The general would be in the third vehicle, which was an armored Land Cruiser with slightly different antenna configuration than the others. An experienced observer with a spotting scope would identify it in seconds. Al-Rimi would identify it in less than that. I had a window. Maybe 10 minutes between the time the convoy became visible on the approach road and the time it reached the Wadi choke point. 10 minutes in which Al-Rimi would be shifting from observation to final firing solution the moment he would reveal himself just enough to make the shot. I needed that moment. I could not shoot the shadow. Not at this range, not with this margin. I needed him to give me something: a barrel, a shoulder, the distinctive profile of a man committing to a trigger pull. And, to give me that, he needed to believe he was alone. Which meant every decision I had made for 6 days, the cold food, the rotated sleep, the non-movement, the silence, had been aimed at this, making 2,610 meters of air between us feel like nobody's air. At 0830, I ate the last cold component of my last MRE. Bean and rice. It was terrible. I ate it completely. Timmons passed me 2 remaining Skittles. Red ones. He'd been saving them. I didn't say anything. I ate the Skittles. At 0915 the wind died. Just stopped. The valley went completely still. Temperature rising, thermal columns beginning to build, and, in that window between the morning northeast wind and the midday southwest flow, the air hung motionless and transparent. The kind of air that makes long-range shooting feel, for a moment, like a conversation between you and the target rather than a problem in applied physics. I settled deeper into the stock. My eye went to the scope. At 0940, the convoy became visible on the approach road. Even at this distance, through the night force at its maximum magnification, I could see the dust column they threw up, a lazy rising plume the color of old bone against the morning sky. Convoys on approach, Kelleher said, confirming what I already saw. I moved my reticle off the convoy. Put it back on the rock cluster. The shadow. For 40 seconds, nothing. Then, a shift. Not the shadow. Something above the shadow. A slight change in the profile of the rock cluster's upper edge, less than a millimeter in my scope, but, at this magnification, a millimeter was real. A deliberate repositioning. Something extending forward from the upper right edge of the largest boulder, a horizontal protrusion that hadn't been there on any previous observation. A barrel. Ghazwan al-Rimi was moving into his final firing position. Target, I said. My voice was mine. Calm. Not performed calm. Actual calm, which surprised me. I've got him, Kelleher said immediately. Barrel is visible. Right side of the primary boulder. He's a pause. He's elevated slightly. His upper body is exposed above the rock profile by approximately, I see it. I did. Just barely. But, I did. The slight humped outline above the boulder's right edge that was not stone, the specific visual signature of a human shoulder and upper back compressed behind a rifle stock. His ghillie and his fieldcraft made him part of the landscape, but nothing could fully hide the geometry of a human body at the moment it commits to a shot. There is something in that position that the eye recognizes. Maybe it's evolutionary. Maybe it's something in us that learned long ago to read that particular shape as danger. I read it. He's settling, Kelleher said. He'll be on the convoy, and I know. Wind's still down. I know. Callaway. I know. I applied my holdover. 302 MOA. I placed the crosshair on the specific subtension mark I had calculated and verified and recalculated over 6 days of living in this limestone shelf. I placed it on the visible upper shoulder profile of the man at 2,610 meters who had killed 11 people and was about to kill a 12th. My heart rate was there. Not gone there. A pulse every second, slightly elevated, the way it always was at this moment. I'd learned not to fight it. You don't shoot between heartbeats because you can will yourself to cardiac stillness. You shoot between heartbeats because you develop such familiarity with your own body's rhythm that you know, without thinking, exactly where the valley is between the beats. I found the valley. I held the reticle. The trigger broke at 18.2 pounds of pressure, which I know because that is what I had confirmed it was set to, and which I know because it broke exactly the way I knew it would, not as a decision but as a consequence, like the end of a sentence that had been building since the moment Hargrove said we've got a problem and looked up from his maps. The rifle spoke. The bullet was in the air for 2.3 seconds. I ran the bolt. In 2.3 seconds a lot of things happen that you don't control. The bullet drops 26 feet along a parabolic arc toward a target you can no longer see because the recoil has broken your sight picture. The wind, which may or may not be what you estimated, applies lateral force along the entire flight path. The Earth rotates very slightly beneath the bullet's trajectory, the Coriolis effect pushing it imperceptibly to the right. Temperature and density altitude affect velocity in ways you've corrected for but never perfectly. The target, if he is a person, may move. May flinch. May shift his weight at the last instant in a way that has nothing to do with knowing you're there. In 2.3 seconds the sum total of everything you've done and everything you know and everything you are either arrives correctly or it doesn't. I ran the bolt and came back onto the scope. The rock cluster at 2,610 meters. The barrel was gone. The shoulder profile was gone. The shadow, the slightly too long shadow, was gone. What was left was the rock cluster exactly as it would have looked if no one had ever been there. For 3 full seconds I didn't breathe. Splash, said Kelleher. It is a word. A brevity code. It means the round has arrived at the target area. It does not mean more than that. It does not mean a hit. It means arrival. Did I hold? I held. 15 seconds. The convoy had stopped at the sound of my shot. The drivers had been briefed that a shot from the northwest would be friendly and to halt and await further instruction, which meant the general was still in his vehicle, alive and stopped rather than dead and stopped. I could see the convoy's dust clouds settling where they'd braked. Kelleher had his eye absolutely still at the spotting scope. I breathed. In. Out. Secondary movement, Kelleher said. The support element, south position, is moving north toward the primary. Running. Not returning fire. Moving toward, he stopped. Kelleher. Yeah, he said. You hit him. What happens after the QRF insertion, the radio traffic, the eventual confirmation through intelligence channels that Ghazwan al-Rimi had been recovered from his position by his support element and had not survived the recovery, all of that happened at a distance from me, in the way that the aftermath of significant things often arrives as administrative detail rather than weight. The weight came later. It always comes later. Kelleher shook my hand in the rock shelf with the limestone slab leaning over us and the valley laid out below and the convoy beginning to move again on the road. He didn't say anything and I didn't either, and it was the second time in my life that silence had been fuller than whatever words would have fit inside it. Timon said, "Holy," and stopped himself, which was its own kind of eloquence. We exfiltrated at 1,440 hours after a 4-hour hold to let al-Rimi's support element clear the sector. The walk back to the helicopter pickup zone was different from the walk in. Not easier. Different. The shale was the same. The cold was the same. My boots moved the same way through the same terrain. But I was carrying something different in the way that has nothing to do with weight or kit. In the helicopter I looked out the porthole window at the valley getting smaller below us and I thought about the 4 seconds I'd seen his face. The relaxation in it. The man who had found his natural state in this kind of work and had lived inside it for years. And I thought about the fact that I didn't feel any of the things the stories tell you that you're supposed to feel. Not triumph. Not relief. Not the particular resolution of tension that war movies are built around. What I felt was closer to what you feel when a very long and very hard problem is finally solved, a quiet exhaustion, and a clear-eyed awareness that the problem, while solved, has left marks that will require longer than a helicopter ride to assess. Back at FOB Salerno, Hargrove met us on the landing strip. He looked at Kelleher. Kelleher gave a single nod. Hargrove turned to me. For a moment he just looked at my face with an expression I didn't have vocabulary for at the time. Something between gravity and gratitude, or maybe the two were the same thing in this particular context. He said, "Good work, specialist." That was all. I said, "Yes, sir." And then I went and found Diaz, who was in the aid station doing supply inventory, and I sat down on the cot nearest the door and she took one look at me and set down her clipboard and didn't ask me anything. She just sat next to me, and after a minute she picked up her pen and continued writing her letter home, and the sound of the pen on the paper was one of the most comforting sounds I had ever heard. I sat there for a long time. I've been asked, since then, in debriefs, in the kind of conversations that happen late in the evening when people feel like they can ask the real questions, whether I was scared. I say yes, because that's true. They ask what I was scared of. I used to say the shot. The distance. The margin. That's only partly true. What I was scared of, what I'm still working out how to say, is harder to name. It has to do with the 4 seconds I watched a man breathe like he was at home in his own living room, and the fact that at 2,610 meters what separated his living room from where I lay was just air and time and the particular decision I had been sent there to make. Distance is strange. It makes things abstract in ways that proximity doesn't allow. At 3,000 yards you could almost believe the thing you're doing is theoretical. Almost. I was 23 years old. I was from a small nothing town in East Tennessee. I had joined because I needed the college money and because I had always been able to shoot and because something in me, some specific, stubborn, Appalachian hard something, had to know whether I was as good as I thought I was. I found out. I'm still not sure how I feel about that. What I know is this: the ANA General completed his site inspection of the Debala substation that afternoon. He returned to Kabul on a helicopter. He is alive. The men and women who have to drive that patrol route through the Wadi Ben drive it now without a particular shadow on the ridgeline. That matters. That has to be enough. Some days it is. My father called me when I got back to the States, 3 months later. He'd heard something, the way people hear things in small towns, not the details, not the classified parts, just the outline. Just enough. He called me on a Sunday morning when I was sitting on the porch of my cousin's house in Knoxville drinking coffee and watching a gray March sky make up its mind about whether to rain. He didn't ask me what happened. He said, "You okay, baby?" I held the phone for a moment. "Yeah," I said. "I think so." And then, he said nothing, for a long time, and the silence was full of everything it needed to be, and somewhere in East Tennessee my father sat with whatever he knew about his daughter and what she had become, and I sat with the gray sky above Knoxville, and the distance between us was nothing. Just air. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, names, events, and military operations depicted are entirely invented. Specialist Nora Calloway does not exist, but the kind of courage this story tries to describe does.